Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Last King by Amabel Daniels, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Since Heir Prince Eisen traveled through the northern region of Contermerria, scouts have warned of predators. For months, reports ran rife that trouble awaited us. Our isolated village of Dran was vulnerable to attacks far from the royal cities and too near the Sword Forest, but I wasn't afraid. It wouldn't be the first time in my 22 years that the village of Dran suffered violence. Whether it be Fressens, the ice beasts slipping out of the tall spires of the sword, vagabonds in the wild, King Van Zed's elite soldiers who lorded over through their feudal villages, or a stampede of shaggy saber horns, expecting the worst was a way of life. Even so, what was the point of fear? We couldn't stand our ground and fight back, but we could always escape to the caverns beneath the mountains. Cowardly, perhaps, but what else was there to do? I'd choose survival every day. Recent news only induced worry, gossiped what-ifs, and an uptick in thefts from the food mart. According to the magistrate, it seemed imminent we'd relocate to the caverns sooner than later. I wasn't so sure. It was hard enough being trapped in this forsaken village, but to hunker down with my fellow neighbors in a deep cave was a misery I wished to avoid. "This is it?" Mrs. Gibbon peered at me, clutching the miniature glass of clove sap to her chest. An unhappy toddler clung to her right side, red-eyed from wailing and pouting. Behind her, his twin crawled closer, crying and clutching at her thick skirt. "That is it," I confirmed, doing my best not to wince at the ear-splitting noise from her home. I set one foot back, angling to make my hasty departure. As I gripped the bar to unlock the door, my fingers slipped free of the thick beam, sliding down the deep grooves Fressened claws had left from a previous attack. 12 years ago. For over a decade, we'd been spared from the Fressens finding Dran, but now chatter abounded. Scouts and patrols seemed to worry that they crept near. "Maren." Mrs. Gibbon moved awfully fast for a distressed woman encumbered by children. She held tight to my hand, tugging me back and stomping on my hope to get out before she'd beg. "Maren, this cannot be it." Thrusting the small glassware at me, she scowled, her ruddy cheeks competing with her son's complexion. "You must be joking. This is not funny, not at all." I shook my head, yanking my hand free. Someone invading my space and daring to touch me, to manhandle me, rose my instinct to reach for my dagger. I was a healer, not a fighter, but that innate pull to react, to defend, always lurked beneath my skin. "She's not a threat. She's not an enemy. Not really." Mrs. Gibbon wasn't a friend, but she wouldn't hurt me. Clenching and releasing my fingers, I smoothed my cloak back over my shoulder, resisting the instant urge to fight back. "Mrs. Gibbon, that's all I have." She squeezed her eyes shut. "No, it can't be all. I want more." Sharing her sentiment, or rather reminding me of why the haggard mother protested the scant teething ointment I could procure, the toddler opened his drooling mouth and screamed a louder cry as he fisted his mother's hair. In the back of the common room, the newborn woke and added his wail too. Wrenching her bloodshot eyes open, she stared at me trance-like. "Maren, this cannot be it. I cannot do this. I haven't slept in days, in weeks. I cannot do this anymore. Give me more now." Pity almost rose to the surface, but her demeanor squashed it. "I'll tell the magistrate," she threatened hotly. I'll tell him you're bilking me." Crossed my arms and narrowed my eyes, my sympathy vanishing. "Then give it back." I held my hand out. Tugging the small jar back to her chest, she sputtered, "I'll tell him you're gouging me for the price of treatment." "I gave you that jar for free," I reminded her dryly. If we were called to retreat to the caverns, it was the least I could do. The entire village would riot, being trapped with inconsolable, teething toddlers. Mrs. Gibbon was so stingy, I'd rather sacrifice the few coins and ration my dinner than put up with her arguing for the fee of oral cream. I'd saved Mrs. Gibbon as the last stop of my long day because I knew she'd be bitter no matter what I could provide. Her nostrils flared. "I'll tell him." "Lies, Mrs. Gibbon. You'll tell him lies." "I'm no liar." She licked her lips, shouting to be heard over her children. "I'll tell him you've been slacking and she straightened, hefting the wailing boy higher on her hip. "You are. You can't be doing your duties if you only have this to offer me." Again, she jabbed her fist toward my face, emphasizing the lackluster amount of clover sap I'd produced. I shoved her hand away. "I've been prohibited from the sword for 3 months now." You have. Mr. Willems says signs of Freston's come closer every day. He's out there like the other brave patrollers, keeping us safe and protected in the village. You have the privilege of those fine men like my Willem watching the woods and warning us of an attack, risking their lives day and night, separated from their families while they endure their watch. Why, Willem has gone above and beyond, volunteering for twice as many shifts. Gee, I wonder why he would want to escape this house. I backed up, slamming the bar up and opening the door as she ranted. And you can't even do your part? She followed me wild-eyed and riled up from her favorite pastime, aside from birthing children, belittling me. You can't step up and see to your duties as a healer, and clove sap comes from the root of rime clove, which I harvest from the eastern edge of the forest. If I cannot obtain the rime clove, I cannot obtain the sap. I slid my sleeve down to cover most of my palm. Reaching outside toward her doorframe, I cracked off a chunk of ice. I'm telling him, I'll tell the magistrate you're slacking in your duties. You'll get that nice home without any proper dues or rent to pay. She cackled a mean laugh. We'll see how long that will last. I'll get word to him. Oh, we'll see how long you'll keep that big house for free. I didn't waste my energy correcting her. That nice big house? What a delusional reference to the basement of the old library I called home. That damp, dank, dark hovel the magistrate so graciously allowed me to claim in exchange for healing without proper dues to pay. Vermin had the sense to avoid that hovel. I busted off the sharp edges from the ice, seething as I eyed her common room. A house with an actual fireplace, real windows, even if thick frost covered the panes. Beds with mattresses, wooden floors, a table for cooking. How could anyone think I maintained that basement for free? I'd never taken on the task of tabulating the hours I spent as a midwife, nurse, and healer as Dran's all-around health practitioner. If I were to name a price for the services I provided for our village, I'd deserve a real abode with true heat and light. You and your sister, both of you wastes of space, she snarled high and mighty. I slitted my eyes, stilling my hands on the ice. Waste of space, huh? Why don't I just take that jar back then, you awful woman? You slack and don't have the decency to make adequate ointments and tonics, just lazing around. Then Thea teaching from those old ratty books no one cares about. She snorted, proclaiming us as wastrels. You say one more word about my sister. Again, the burning itch to reach for my dagger teased me. I'd never resorted to fighting back, but she tempted me. Instead, I tuned out her rants as I extended my hand to dip into the jar. Once my fingertip was slick with the clove sap ointment, I smeared it around the oval ice chunk. A faint blue mist eased up in a vapor as I coaxed the rage-old remedy into potency. My advice? I don't want advice, you good-for-nothing fool. I need more clove sap. And don't waste it this time. I wrapped the ice around a piece of paper for my satchel. A little goes a long way. I handed the toddler the ice chunk coated with sap. He took it, the curiosity in his big blue eyes a welcome break from the nonstop crying. After he stuck it in his mouth, he slurped, gumming on it with the start of a smile. Turning my back to her, I pushed the door open further to slip out into the night. The wind had picked up, nearly shutting the door while I'd formed that ice treat. Harsh winds were a constant in our valley so near the northern peaks, but this was different, harder, colder, firmer. I frowned, fastening my cloak tighter and tucking my head down to avoid the sting in my eyes. This change in the air felt ominous, dark, and foreboding. Mrs. Gibbons slammed the door shut behind me, and I jerked at the sharp noise. I scoffed at myself, those fanciful and childlike thoughts of blaming the air for my mood. This wind wasn't my problem. That woman was. Everyone in Dran was. No thanks. No farewell. Gratitude? I'd learned not to expect any, but that didn't erase the sting. I'd lived my whole life trapped here in Dran, stuck in this remote village, surrounded by snow, unappreciated and nothing more than a scapegoat for everyone's physical woes. Would it be so hard for someone to be thankful just once? I trudged through the icy crust on top of the snow, loathing each step as it signified my confinement in Dran. Drifted over, blown around, and then piled again. It didn't matter the time of the year. This cold never ceased. Snow and ice would never melt. So long as the Vintar Court ruled, it wouldn't change, and as long as King Vanzad's reign covered Contermerria in ice and frost, I would have no means of leaving this prison of a home. The venture from Dran would be death. Barren fields of snow, monsters of ice, where could I ever hope to go? Chin up, I tried to coach myself. I wasn't one to wallow, but Mrs. Gibbons' attitude was rubbing me the wrong way. Or maybe this wind is, I mused, wrapping my scarves higher to cover more of my face. I couldn't shake the grip of dread these gusts left in chilling whips on my cheeks. Boring through my clothes, it seeped into my bones. Chin up, face forward, hurry on. I shook my head, trying to banish this drama I had no time for. Wind is wind. Couldn't carry anything else. If it did, I didn't have the time or energy to face it. As reports of a predator came in, Dran's 300 villagers' excitement and fear scaled higher. Both of those emotions meant the same thing to me, the only healer. For weeks now, I'd done my best to keep up with it all. More demands for tonics and constant requests for ointments. Additional visits to the expecting just in case the babe could come today. And please, couldn't I do something to hurry it up? Someone ordered a stock of salves and another commanded me to deliver more yet. And why, if I had any compassion at all, why couldn't I reset that bone now before we headed into the caverns? On top of the fervor of preparing for bunkering down, which may not happen, the magistrate tasked me with shoring up supplies in the cavern. Caches of tonics, supplementary wraps, splints, and bindings, and of course inspecting and double-checking surgical instruments, checking inventory and listing what I needed. Run ragged from dawn to dusk, and like tonight, well past sundown, I focused on making it through the day. Instead of letting the stress and fatigue drag me to my knees, I narrowed my eyes and resisted the bite of the wind. Chin up, Maren. I recalled my mother chiding me to be strong. Face forward, my father had preached. Hold on, the previous healer, Sylvian, lectured after she'd adopted my sister and me. They were all long gone, but their words of wisdom lived on. My day and night was done. I was free to head home. Relaxing wasn't in store for me, but I'd be content to hide in solitude within our hovel. When I hastened down the stairwell, I frowned at the lack of footprints in the steps new as snow. Thea had a lesson for the deputy's son and daughter earlier, but she should have returned by now. It isn't as though she could linger this late. According to the commoners, like Mrs. Gibbon, teaching village youngsters to read was a frivolous waste of time. However, those who wanted to attract the eye of scouts for the Vintar elite troops were all too eager to master some semblance of literacy. Frail from a long-ago bite, Thea was sensitive to the cold and a poorly qualified apprentice for me in my healer's service. She was thin-boned and petite, unfit to help in the radish crops or the stables. Reading was her niche, and I was proud of her mastery. It didn't hurt that our basement residence offered numerous tomes to practice with. As I shut the door behind me, I glanced at the stacks of ancient books from her side of the space. Waxy and spelled against flames, the pages had been tossed aside and dismissed in this basement. For many years, they sat untouched down here, useless for fuel and fires and indecipherable to commoners. Once the magistrate saw my worth of healing, he'd figured this was as good a place as any to keep me close. I frowned, noticing the lack of lamps burning near her stacks. She wasn't home yet. Worrying about her was second nature. Concern for Thea, a living, controlling fear I could never shut off. Despite her weaknesses and disadvantages, she was independent and sufficient. But her staying out this late perturbed me as I set aside my cloak and satchel. Where are you, Thea? All through my preparation of a cold stew, during my routine of washing our cutlery and dishes, and while tending to the sun-deprived herbs in the kitchen, I fretted. Well into the night, as her stew sat uneaten, I tried my best to distract myself with my usual routine. She's not a child, 18 going on 30. She wasn't a youth to tend to anymore. She knows better than to stay out too late. Aware of her physical obstacles, she didn't need a keeper to remind her that the night chill would further weaken her. She's... Deep, hoarse coughs heralded her arrival. Finally. Clattering down the steps, she hurried toward our door. I paused in checking our scant pantry, chastising myself for not charging Mrs. Gibbon. I had a big heart, but Thea needed more nourishment than what little we had. I was foolish to dismiss charges. Facing the door, I frowned as she burst through, hacking and wheezing, shuddering as she fell back and closed the door. Don't nag. Don't scold. Don't... She bent over her knees, out of breath as she trembled. Maren, I'm sorry. Do you have any idea how worried I was? So much for holding my tongue. She knew my sternness came from love. As I did indeed scold, I hurried over, draping a blanket around her shoulders and guiding her toward the kettle on the slim hot plate. For realm's sake, where were you this late? Her slim figure shook as she all but hugged the kettle, now tepidly warm on the plate. Racking her bones either from the force of her coughing the crystals of longo out of her lungs or from the chill set on her pale skin, she fought for breath. Once she found the strength to look up, she peered at me with such a woeful face of sorrow I stilled. I gripped the blanket tighter, keeping it over her. I held my breath, suspended in anxiety. What happened? She licked her chapped lips and cast her gaze on the dirt floor. Thea? I was hiding, she said. Why? Where? I narrowed my gaze and tilted my head, anger simmering deep inside. Did that punk give you trouble again? Wouldn't be the first time the deputy's son tried some funny business. 3 years her junior, but twice her size. She closed her eyes as her stomach grumbled. I frowned, hating myself for scolding her first. My temper was never easy to control, but for Thea, I always tried to do better for her. Keeping the blanket over her shoulders, I leaned over to snatch the bowl of her stew. Eat, then tell me, please. It was the least I could do. I couldn't save her from the long goo infecting her inside out. I couldn't have stopped her from being bitten all those years ago. I could only pray she forgave me for my failures and let me comfort and protect her as penance. She swallowed hard and pushed away the stew. I was so hungry. I pushed her bowl closer. Then eat. The deputy's wife, her maid was making bread. Thea peered up at me. In the oven. The smells, Maren. Realm above, Maren, the smells. It's enough to drive anyone delirious. Oh, no. Garrett noticed during the lesson. He saw that I watched the maid in the kitchen. My stomach growled, and I stood up straight, the implication setting the need for revenge on fire inside me. No, Maren, no, he didn't. She coughed again. He didn't force, not that. Then what? So the punk spared her this time. I waited until the lesson was over. Then I doubled back and took a small burnt loaf. The maid had tossed it into the refuse, but once the crust was cracked off, it was fine. I let my shoulders drop, exhaling long and hard as tension left me. Theft? A simple theft of someone else's trash, so what? Thea's slim stature was an advantage here. It wouldn't have been that first time she'd pocketed a leftover. It wasn't the first time anyone in Dran succumbed to taking food out of a trash bin. I wasn't proud of her or the act of theft at all, but if it was a choice between starving and surviving, simple. Survive. Did anyone see you? She shook her head. Not that time. Again, I stiffened. I felt so bad that you wouldn't have any. Yeah, no. I gripped her shoulder. No. Yes, she rubbed her face. I went back. You know how she bundles up bread for the mart? In that big basket? When the maid wasn't there, I took the smallest one for you. You deserve something warm and hearty, too. We all do. But Garrett caught me. He happened to round the corner and saw me yelling for his father, so I ran and hid. Tears streaked down her cheek. I dropped the loaf, Maren. I'm so sorry. That she was apologetic about dropping the loaf and not being able to feed me was admirable. Her being caught stealing was, well, it was a minor inconvenience. I'm sorry, she sniffled. They were looking for me. Garrett told his father, and I heard the deputy say he'd arrest me. That boy. Anger firmed her face into a scowl. He lied, saying I also stole some coins lying out on the table, that I took them during the lesson. Of course he did. That teen was the sort to kick harder than when someone was down. Sighing, I patted her back and pushed the stew closer to her, urging her to eat. It'll be okay, Thea. When? How? When? It feels like never. How? I've got no clue. Knocks pounded on the door before I could make up an answer. Thea? Maren? The deputy's nasally shout came through clearly. Open up! Thea clutched my hand, her thin, ice-cold fingers digging into my flesh. Maren, she whispered, don't answer it. And hide where? We're trapped down here, not even a window to slip through. I shot her a side eye. You're under arrest, the deputy hollered. Now open up. Stay here until I'm out, I told her quietly. Wouldn't be the first time I visited the jail in her place. They need me too much to make a big deal out of this. Maren, she begged, I'm so sorry. Tired, I faced the door and watched the wood bounce under the force of his hammering knocks. Promise me you'll stay inside, Thea. I'm sure it'll only be for the night. You know they need to make an example out of it, lest anyone think they can get away with theft. In fact, go visit Mrs. Maren for the night. Read to her girls, help her cook. You know, she'll keep an eye out for you. Maren, don't go. Thea sniffled, holding my hand. Not for me. Don't protect me. It's my fault. Open up, the deputy cursed and kicked at the door, or I'll knock this door down. I'll always protect you, Thea. I heard the jail is full, Thea said. They caught up with thief and some other vagabonds the patrollers caught. And Jonan and Luca were fighting at the pub. Don't go for me, she stumbled as she shook my head. Hide out with Mrs. Ammer. Drawing a deep breath for patience, I strode for the door as I told her again. I'll only be gone for the night.